April 8th, 1945. 1400 hours, near the Elbe River, Germany. The air was thick with the scent of burnt metal. A single German soldier, his uniform torn and covered in dust, steps forward, hands trembling in surrender. But what drove him, and thousands like him, to beg for mercy from the very enemy they once fought? The battlefield was eerily silent, save for the occasional crackle of distant gunfire and the groaning of twisted metal. Amidst the smoke and the wreckage of war, a lone German soldier stepped forward, his uniform torn and grimy, stained with sweat and blood. The ground beneath him was muddy, churned up by the chaos of retreat and death. His face, a mask of exhaustion and fear, was a haunting image of surrender. His rifle, once a weapon of pride, now hung limply in his hands, useless in the face of the advancing enemy. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The soldier's gaze shifted from the American soldiers ahead to the remnants of his comrades, most of them crouched low, eyeing the situation with suspicion, fear, and disbelief. This was no ordinary moment of surrender. This was a last act of desperation. The harshness of the Eastern Front had already broken them. The devastation of the Western advance now left them with nothing but the bitter realization of inevitable defeat. He raised his hands slowly, as if each movement drained his soul, each gesture a final goodbye to everything he had once fought for. This wasn't a soldier seeking glory, or a commander demanding respect. This was a man, broken and aware of the futility of his cause. This was surrender, not just of a soldier, but of an entire ideology. The sight of one man dropping to his knees in front of the American forces spoke volumes. The fear in his eyes was raw, undeniable. But beneath it, something else stirred. Relief. Relief at no longer having to fight for a war that had lost all meaning, for an ideology that had condemned him to an endless cycle of destruction. The hopelessness in his expression was not just fear of death, but fear of the consequences of surviving. But his surrender would not be the end of it. It was only the beginning of a profound realization for thousands of other soldiers who had followed him into the chaos of war. And for the Americans witnessing it, it was the beginning of the end, an end that had been coming for years, but now felt like an inevitable certainty. By the spring of 1945, Nazi Germany's once vaunted military machine was crumbling from within. The tide of war had long since turned against them. The Battle of Stalingrad, the defeat at El Alamein, the D-Day landings, these had been only the beginning of the end. The Allies, through sheer manpower and strategic brilliance, were tightening their grip on Germany from both the east and the west. The American forces, having launched a successful campaign through Western Europe following D-Day, now pushed deeper into Germany. The Soviets, from the east, were closing in on Berlin, their unstoppable march ensuring that the Third Reich had no way out. The few remaining German troops, who had once believed in victory, were now caught between two fronts, surrounded and outmatched. For the soldiers on the ground, the collapse of the Nazi regime was not an abstract concept. It was a cold, brutal reality. Their commanders, many of whom had fed them lies and empty promises, were nowhere to be found. There was no longer any glory in battle, no longer any faith in the ideals they had been taught. As the Allies advanced, so did the realization that the war was lost. The German soldiers had been fighting not just against foreign armies, but against the inexorable force of history itself. But this realization came too late. The troops that had once marched proudly under the swastika were now fighting simply to survive. They were no longer soldiers, they were men who had been betrayed by their leaders, by their own country, and by the false promises of victory. The ones who could began to surrender in droves. They were exhausted, mentally and physically drained by a war that had spiraled beyond their control. And yet, surrender was a terrifying prospect. To surrender to the Allies was to risk disgrace, even death. Many German soldiers knew that once they were taken prisoner, they would face retribution for their part in the atrocities of the war. The horrors they had witnessed and inflicted would follow them, whether they were guilty or not. The Allies' treatment of POWs was harsh, but the alternative, fighting until the last man fell, was even worse. What were they to do? They could no longer fight for a cause that was already dead. The fall of Berlin was more than just a military defeat. It was the symbolic end of a monstrous ideology that had sought to remake the world in its image. For years, Adolf Hitler and his regime had promised the German people victory, glory, and dominance. But by 1945, the reality of defeat was undeniable. The promises had fallen apart, the fascist state had crumbled, and the people who had once supported it were left with nothing but the ruins of their country. For the German soldiers, the collapse of the Nazi war machine was an existential crisis. They had been taught to believe in the supremacy of their cause, the righteousness of their mission. Yet with every town they saw fall, with every loss on the battlefield, their belief in the Third Reich's promises began to unravel. The totalitarian nature of Nazi Germany had conditioned them to follow orders without question. But now, faced with the undeniable reality of defeat, their obedience turned into despair. They had been living in a system that valued them only as instruments of war, as expendable pieces in a monstrous game. In the end, they were discarded. When it became clear that the war was lost, many German soldiers realized they had been nothing more than pawns in a cruel game of survival. The collapse of the Nazi regime was not just the end of a military power. It was the dismantling of an entire worldview. The very ideologies that had motivated millions of people to fight, to kill, and to die were exposed as empty, hollow lies. The realization was staggering. For those soldiers who surrendered, there was no longer any sense of duty or pride in their service. The fight had lost all meaning. Their commanders, who had once preached about the greatness of the Reich, had led them into a disaster of catastrophic proportions. In their surrender, they weren't just giving up on their military objectives, they were letting go of the very ideologies that had sustained them through the darkest years of the war. It was a painful, humbling moment of reckoning. For many of them, it was the beginning of a new life, one that would be filled with shame, regret, and a deep sense of loss. This moment of surrender wasn't just about losing a war. It was about the loss of an entire belief system, the collapse of the ideological foundation that had motivated millions of soldiers to fight for a cause that ultimately led them to destruction. These soldiers were not just victims of a military conflict. They were victims of a corrupt, totalitarian ideology that had promised them victory and glory, but delivered only devastation. In their surrender, they came face to face with the brutality of the system they had supported. It wasn't just a loss of life. It was the destruction of everything they had been taught to believe in. For them, surrender was not a choice between life and death, but between surviving in a shattered world and continuing to fight for an empty cause. As the German soldiers knelt before the advancing American troops, their fate hung in the balance. The air was thick with tension as both sides faced the gravity of the moment. The Germans, who had been the mighty conquerors of Europe only a few years prior, now found themselves at the mercy of the very people they had once sought to destroy. It was a surreal moment, one that seemed to defy all logic and reason. The soldiers' eyes met those of the Americans. Some were full of fear, others empty and distant, as if their spirits had already left their bodies. Yet, there was also a sense of something else, something deeper beneath the surface. It was not just fear of death that gripped them. It was the overwhelming realization that they had been complicit in something far greater than themselves. This was not merely a military surrender. It was the crumbling of an entire belief system that had driven them to commit unimaginable atrocities. In contrast, The American soldiers, who had witnessed firsthand the horrors of the war and the brutality of the Nazi regime, were not filled with anger or vengeance. Instead, there was something different, something almost tragic in their gaze as they looked at these defeated men. It wasn't victory they saw in front of them. It was the cost of war. The sheer, indescribable cost of everything that had been lost in the pursuit of a misguided, monstrous ideology. As the surrender unfolded, the Americans knew that these men, who had once marched proudly under the swastika, were now broken, defeated, and without purpose. They had been forced to fight not for their own survival, but for a cause that had lost all meaning. And now they faced the consequences of their actions, not as heroes, but as men who had been misled, manipulated, and ultimately left with nothing but the bitter reality of their defeat. The true weight of their surrender wasn't just felt in the immediate aftermath of the war, it was felt in the profound realization that despite everything they had been told, despite all the promises of glory and honor, they had been fighting for an ideology that had led to nothing but death and destruction. Their surrender was not just to the American forces, it was a surrender to the very reality of the war they had waged. In the days following their surrender, the German soldiers were taken as prisoners of war. For some, this was the end of their military journey, but for others, it marked the beginning of a new struggle. The aftermath of the war left them facing not only the physical scars of battle, but also the emotional and psychological toll of their actions during the war. As prisoners, many of the German soldiers faced harsh conditions in Allied captivity. While some were treated with a sense of humanity, others were not so fortunate. The Allies were determined to hold them accountable for the atrocities committed during the war, especially those who had been part of the Nazi regime's military apparatus. The Nuremberg trials would soon begin, and many soldiers would face the consequences of their involvement in the atrocities of the war. However, for the majority of the men who had fought for Germany, the true punishment was not the physical hardship of captivity, but the realization of what their nation had become. For many, the surrender marked the end of an era, a tragic end to a time when they had believed in the ideals of Nazi Germany. They had fought not just for the survival of their country, but for the belief that they were part of something greater than themselves. And now, in the face of surrender, they were left with nothing. For the civilians and the German nation as a whole, the aftermath of the war was equally devastating. The country was in ruins, both physically and psychologically. The defeat of Nazi Germany led to a massive reckoning, as the nation had to come to terms with the horrors that had been committed in its name. The German people, many of whom had supported the Nazi regime, were now forced to face the consequences of their blind allegiance. The soldiers who had surrendered were left to deal with the shame and guilt of their actions. Some would return to their homes to rebuild their lives, while others would be haunted by the ghosts of the war for the rest of their days. The war was over, but the psychological scars it left on the men who fought in it would linger for decades to come. The surrender of the German soldiers in 1945 was not just the end of a military conflict, it was the end of an entire world, a world that had been built on the foundations of lies, hatred, and delusion. The soldiers who surrendered were not just giving up on a battle, but on everything they had once believed in. The ideologies that had driven them to fight and kill had crumbled around them, leaving only the wreckage of their once proud nation and their own shattered psyches. This moment of surrender serves as a reminder of the destructive power of ideologies that dehumanize others and justify violence in the name of a greater good. The German soldiers who surrendered were not just victims of war. They were victims of a system that had used them as pawns in a monstrous game. Their surrender was not just a physical act, but a philosophical one, a rejection of the very ideology that had brought them to this point. As they knelt in the dirt facing the advancing Americans, they were not just surrendering to an enemy. They were surrendering to the truth. They had been part of a system that had promised them glory but delivered only destruction. Their surrender was not just a military defeat, but the recognition of the ultimate futility of war and the ideologies that fuel it. April 8, 1945, near the Elbe River, Germany. The soldier's hands remained raised, trembling, his eyes staring into the distance. The sound of war had faded, but the silence that followed was deafening. The ground beneath him, once soaked with the blood of countless battles, now felt like an unyielding reminder of everything that had been lost. In the distance, the smoke from a ruined battlefield swirled into the sky, like a dark echo of the war that had torn apart a continent. The American soldiers, having seen the worst of what humanity could do to one another, regarded the surrendered men not with anger, but with something more, something colder. It was not victory that stood before them, but the eerie calm of an end that had been long in coming. The soldier, now just a man who had fought for a cause that no longer made sense, stood amidst the remnants of a war that had consumed so much. For him, for all of them, the war was over, but the scars would remain. The uniform they wore, stained with the blood of their comrades and enemies alike, was now nothing more than a symbol of defeat, a symbol of the great lie they had all been part of. The surrender marked not just the end of a battle, but the collapse of an entire world view. In the shadow of the Elbe River, amidst the ashes of the Third Reich, the soldiers' surrender was the last tragic admission of guilt, an admission that, in the end, there was no such thing as glory in war, only the hollow remnants of survival. As the German soldiers were led away, their fate was sealed not by the power of the American forces, but by the realization of their own futility. The great machine they had once fought for had crumbled, and they were left to pick up the pieces. For the soldiers who surrendered, it was not just a physical defeat, but a philosophical reckoning. They had been part of something bigger than themselves, something they believed in, and now that belief had been shattered. The horrors they had witnessed, the actions they had committed, would haunt them forever. The moment of surrender, on that fateful day in April, wasn't just a turning point in the war. It was a turning point in history. It was the beginning of the end for a regime that had promised dominance, but left only destruction in its wake. It was the end of the myth of glory, the realization that war, no matter how noble its cause may seem, is nothing but a cycle of suffering and loss. As the soldiers were marched away from the battlefield, their once proud heads now bowed in shame, the world moved on. But their surrender, their defeat, would remain a poignant reminder of the cost of war. It wasn't just the land that was ruined, it was the very fabric of humanity itself. The belief in a cause greater than oneself, the promises of glory and power, had been exposed for what they truly were, empty, hollow promises that led only to despair. In the years that followed, the soldiers who surrendered were forgotten by history. But their story, like so many others, is a tale of regret, of lost innocence, and of the terrible consequences of unchecked power. The ruins of the war, both physical and psychological, would remain for generations to come. The Tiger tank, once a symbol of Nazi power, now sits in a Belgian museum, its fuel gauge frozen at empty, a fitting monument to when courage met mathematics and lost. But perhaps the true monument to that time is not the tank, but the quiet surrender of the soldiers who fought and died for a cause that was ultimately doomed. It is their story, their defeat, and their surrender that remains, etched in the history of a war that will never be forgotten. This is where we leave the story, not with a neat conclusion, but with an open reflection. The surrender of the German soldiers in 1945 is a reminder that, in war, there are no winners. There are only those who survive and those who are left to reckon with the consequences of what they have done. The real question is not about who won or lost, but what lessons we take from it and how we prevent the cycle of war from repeating again.